I stood at the edge of the property, the deed to my grandfather's farm clutched in one hand and a folded piece of yellowed paper in the other. The wind picked up, rustling through the cornfields that stretched out before me. My grandfather Caden had left me everything, 40 acres of farmland in rural Pennsylvania that had been in our family for generations. I unfolded the note again, reading through the 4 rules he'd written in his shaky handwriting. 1. Never enter the east barn after dark. 2. Never turn your back on the scarecrow in the north field. 3. If you see a woman in white near the tree line, don't acknowledge her presence. 4. If you hear singing at night, stay inside with the doors locked. I shook my head and stuffed the paper into my jacket pocket. Caden had always been a bit eccentric, especially in his later years. These rules seemed like the ramblings of an old man whose mind had started to wander. Still, something about the seriousness of his handwriting made me pause before dismissing them completely. The farmhouse stood about 50 yards away, a 2-story white clapboard structure with a wraparound porch and green shutters that needed repainting. I grabbed my duffel bag from the truck and headed toward what was now my home. The front door creaked as I pushed it open. The smell hit me immediately, musty air mixed with the scent of old wood and something I couldn't quite place. I set my bag down in the entryway and took a moment to look around. The living room was just as I remembered from my childhood visits, worn furniture arranged around a stone fireplace, family photos lining the mantel, and Caden's ancient recliner positioned perfectly to see both the television and the front window. I spent that first day just wandering through the house, running my fingers over family heirlooms and opening drawers filled with my grandfather's belongings. His reading glasses still sat on the nightstand beside his bed, a farming magazine open to an article about winter wheat. In the kitchen, I found his coffee mug in the dish rack, as if he'd just washed it that morning instead of being gone for nearly a month now. The next morning, I decided to explore the property. The main barn stood about 100 yards behind the house, a classic red structure with white trim that housed the tractor and most of the farming equipment. I spent an hour just looking through the tools, mentally cataloging what I'd need to repair and what could still be used. It wasn't until I walked to the far edge of the property that I saw the east barn. Unlike the well-maintained main barn, this structure seemed deliberately neglected. Gray weathered boards made up its exterior, with windows boarded up from the inside. What caught my attention most were the heavy chains wrapped around the door handles, secured with 3 different padlocks. I walked closer, curious about what my grandfather might have kept locked up so thoroughly. As I approached, a strange feeling washed over me, like the air had suddenly grown colder despite the warm spring day. I reached out toward one of the padlocks, then hesitated. Rule number 1 echoed in my head: never enter the east barn after dark. It wasn't dark yet, but something kept me from trying to open those locks anyway. I backed away, telling myself I'd come back with bolt cutters another time. There was plenty else to do anyway. The rest of that first week was consumed with making the farmhouse livable again. I cleaned out the refrigerator, dusted every surface, and fixed the leaky faucet in the upstairs bathroom. I made trips into town for groceries and supplies, gradually meeting some of the locals who had known my grandfather. Jackson Neal, who owned the farm bordering our property to the west, stopped by on my 4th day there. He was a stocky man in his 50s with calloused hands and a no-nonsense attitude. "Thought I'd come by and welcome you properly," he said, handing me a basket of vegetables from his garden. "Your grandfather was a good neighbor, best farmer in the county if you ask me." "Thanks," I said, accepting the basket. "I'm still figuring out what I'm going to do with all this land. I don't have much farming experience." Jackson nodded, looking out over the fields. Caden kept good records. You'd do well to follow his crop rotations. He knew this land better than anyone. We talked about practical matters for a while, when to plant, what equipment I might need to repair or replace. But when I mentioned the east barn, Jackson's expression changed. "That old thing? Not much use to you, I expect. Caden never did much with it. Do you know why he kept it locked up like that? I asked. Jackson's eyes shifted away from mine. Some buildings just aren't worth the trouble of fixing up. Your grandfather had his reasons for leaving it be. Before he left, Jackson gave me one last piece of advice. Caden had a way of doing things around here. Might seem odd to outsiders, but it worked for him. You'd do well to respect his methods. The next day, I visited the feed store in town. A woman named Josephine Pierce helped me gather supplies, seed for the kitchen garden I planned to start, some basic tools, and feed for the chickens I'd inherited along with everything else. Lawrence Farm, right? She asked as she rang up my purchases. Caden's grandson? I nodded. Just moved in last week. Your grandfather was a fixture around here for decades, she said with a warm smile. Came in every month like clockwork for his supplies. Always paid in cash, always had a kind word for everyone. People seem to have really respected him, I said. Oh, absolutely. Caden understood things about farming that most people have forgotten. She paused, then added, he knew how to work with the land, not against it. I decided to probe a bit. The property has some quirks. That east barn, for instance. Josephine's smile faltered slightly. Well, every old farm has its oddities. That's what gives them character. She quickly changed the subject, asking about my plans for the chicken coop. This pattern repeated itself with everyone I met who had known my grandfather. They'd speak highly of him, share stories about his farming prowess or his generosity, but whenever I brought up anything about the farm's history or asked specific questions about the property, they'd become evasive or find reasons to end the conversation. By the end of my first week, I'd settled into something of a routine. I'd wake early, tend to the chickens, work on repairs around the house, and plan what to do with the fields. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something about this place that everyone knew but me. One evening, as the sun began to set, I found myself drawn back to the east barn. The chains gleamed dully in the fading light, and as I stood there, watching the shadows lengthen across the weathered boards, I felt it again, that unsettling sensation, as if the barn itself was somehow aware of my presence. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my grandfather's note, reading through those 4 strange rules again. Maybe they weren't just the ramblings of an old man after all. Maybe Caden Lawrence had been trying to tell me something important about this place I'd inherited. As darkness fell completely, I backed away from the east barn, suddenly very conscious of the first rule on that list. I didn't know what was inside that building, but I was beginning to think my grandfather had good reasons for keeping it locked up tight. I'd been getting into a good routine with the farm. After that first week of settling in, I started tackling the more substantial projects Caden had left behind. The fences needed work in several spots, especially along the western edge where a few posts had rotted through at the base. I grabbed supplies from the main barn that Tuesday morning, fresh lumber, a post hole digger, and some tools. The day was cool but sunny, perfect for outdoor work. As I hauled everything out to the damaged section, I cut through the north cornfield to save time. That's when I noticed something off. The scarecrow stood about 50 yards away, centered in the field. I'd seen it before, of course. A standard farm fixture with a burlap head stuffed with straw, worn overalls, and a faded plaid shirt that had seen better days. But something wasn't right. I stopped walking, tools still in hand, and stared at it. The scarecrow was facing a different direction. I was sure it had been looking east toward the sunrise yesterday, arms outstretched toward the rows of corn. Now it faced southwest, toward the house. I set down my supplies and walked closer, keeping my eyes fixed on it. The straw-stuffed figure hadn't just swiveled slightly from wind or weather. It had completely changed position, pivoting at least 90 degrees. "What the hell?" I muttered. I approached until I stood about 10 feet away. The thing was secured to its wooden cross post, just as before. Nothing looked disturbed at its base. No footprints, no sign anyone had been here. Yet it had definitely moved. A chill ran through me as I remembered my grandfather's second rule: never turn your back on the scarecrow in the north field. I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes fixed on the burlap face with its crude stitched features. Only when I reached my supplies did I turn and hurry back to my fence repair job, glancing over my shoulder every few minutes to make sure the scarecrow stayed put. All day, while digging post holes and setting new lumber, I felt like I was being watched. I told myself it was ridiculous. It was just a scarecrow, probably shifted by a strong night wind or maybe even some local kids playing a prank. But I couldn't shake the feeling, and I made sure to keep the field in my peripheral vision as I worked. The next few days passed without incident. I fixed 3 sections of fence, made a trip into town for groceries, and tried to put the scarecrow out of my mind, but I found myself checking its position each morning and evening, watching for any changes. 3 nights later, I was reading in the living room when I heard it, singing. At first, I thought it might be a radio from a passing car, or maybe even from Jackson's place down the road. But as I listened, I realized it was coming from somewhere on the property. A woman's voice, high and clear, singing a melody I didn't recognize. The words weren't distinct enough to make out, but the tune itself was haunting, almost like a lullaby but with something unsettling underneath its sweetness. I set my book down and walked to the window. The moon was nearly full, casting enough light to see the yard and fields beyond. The singing seemed to float from somewhere near the tree line at the far edge of the property. Without thinking, I grabbed a flashlight and headed for the door. The melody pulled at me, making me curious about who could be out there at this hour. I stepped onto the porch and started down the steps when a sharp memory cut through my thoughts. Rule 4. If you hear singing at night, stay inside with doors locked. I froze with one foot on the bottom step. The singing continued, beautiful and enticing. For a moment I stood there, torn between investigating and heeding my grandfather's warning. The voice seemed to grow slightly louder, as if moving closer. I backed up the steps, went inside, and locked the door behind me. Then I moved through the house, checking every window and door, making sure each was securely fastened. The singing continued outside, sometimes seeming to come from the front yard, sometimes from the side of the house, as if someone was walking around the perimeter. I settled into Caden's old recliner, the one positioned to see both the TV and the front window, and turned off all the lights. In the darkness, I strained to track the movement of the voice as it circled the house. For nearly an hour, the singing continued, sometimes fading as if moving away, then growing louder again as it returned. I didn't sleep. I sat rigid in that chair, listening as the voice finally began to recede, moving back toward the trees until I could no longer hear it at all. Even then, I stayed put, too unsettled to go upstairs to bed. Morning light eventually filled the room, and I must have dozed off because I jerked awake to sunlight streaming through the windows. My neck was stiff from sleeping upright in the chair. I got up, made coffee, and tried to convince myself that the singing had been a dream, or my imagination working overtime after the scarecrow incident. But as I carried my mug onto the front porch to greet the day, I stopped short. There, in the soft earth around the house, were footprints. Small, delicate impressions of bare feet. They formed a complete circle around the entire house, starting and ending at the bottom of the porch steps. I set my coffee down and followed the tracks. They were clear in the damp soil, showing someone had walked slowly around the perimeter of the house, exactly where the singing had seemed to move. The footprints were too small to be a man's, and they showed no signs of shoes. Just the distinct impression of bare feet with 5 toes, a narrow heel. I followed the trail where it led away from the house, heading across the field. The prints continued in a straight line toward the east barn, becoming fainter as the ground grew harder until they disappeared completely about 20 yards from the chained building. Standing there in the morning light, staring at where the footprints vanished, I felt a profound shift in my understanding of this place. These weren't just strange coincidences or my imagination. Something was happening on my grandfather's farm, something Caden had known about and tried to prepare me for with his 4 simple rules. I pulled the yellowed paper from my pocket where I'd kept it since arriving. The rules that had seemed like the eccentric notions of an old man now felt like vital instructions for survival. The scarecrow that moved when no one was looking, the singing voice that circled the house at night, whatever was locked in the east barn. I carefully folded the paper and put it back in my pocket. From now on, I would be following Caden's rules to the letter. The corn rustled around me as I moved between the rows, filling my basket with the last of this section's yield. I'd been at it since early morning, working methodically through the field, letting the rhythm of harvest keep my thoughts occupied. The farm had settled into an uneasy routine over the past weeks as summer gave way to fall, cooler mornings, earlier sunsets, and increasingly frequent occurrences that followed no natural pattern I could explain. I reached for another ear of corn when something white caught my eye at the field's edge. I straightened up, squinting against the afternoon sun. About 200 yards away, a figure in white moved with deliberate slowness along the boundary where my cornfield met the tree line. A woman, dressed entirely in white. My throat tightened as I watched her drift between the golden stalks and the darkening forest beyond. She seemed to float rather than walk, her dress billowing slightly, though there was hardly any breeze. My first instinct was to call out, to ask who she was and what she wanted on my property. I opened my mouth, then snapped it shut as my grandfather's 3rd rule slammed into my thoughts. If you see a woman in white near the tree line, don't acknowledge her presence. I forced myself to look down at my basket, continuing to pick corn while watching her through my peripheral vision. My hands trembled slightly as I worked, pretending I hadn't noticed her while keeping track of her movements. She paused at the edge of the trees, standing perfectly still for what felt like minutes. Then she turned. I couldn't make out her face from this distance, thank God, and stepped between the trunks, disappearing into the forest shadows. I waited until I was certain she was gone before letting out the breath I'd been holding. My shirt stuck to my back with cold sweat despite the mild afternoon. That was the 3rd rule now broken by whatever forces occupied this land. Only the east barn remained. I gathered my harvest and headed back to the house, deciding I needed answers more substantial than cryptic rules on yellowed paper. The town library occupied a brick building that had once been the post office back in the 30s. I pushed through the heavy wooden doors and was greeted by the familiar smell of old books and the soft yellow glow of reading lamps. "Cody Lawrence," a voice called from behind the main desk. "I wondered when you'd come looking." Lexi Martin peered at me over rectangular reading glasses. The town librarian had to be in her 60s, with silver-gray hair cut in a neat bob and bright, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. "Looking for what, exactly?" I asked, approaching her desk. "Local history," she said, closing the catalog she'd been working on. "Everyone who inherits old property around here eventually comes asking questions. Your grandfather was in here quite often, you know." "I didn't know that," I said. "I'm hoping to learn more about the farm's history, previous owners, any significant events, anything unusual." Something flickered across Lexi's face, caution, maybe recognition, before she nodded. "Follow me to the archives section. We keep county records, newspaper archives, and local historical documents." She led me to a room in the back filled with filing cabinets and shelves of bound newspapers and ledgers. "Property records are in those cabinets," she pointed. "Newspapers are chronological on those shelves. What time period interests you?" "As far back as possible," I said. "I want to understand who owned the place before my grandfather." Lexi pulled several folders from different cabinets and spread them on the reading table. "Your grandfather purchased that property in 1972. Before that..." We spent hours going through documents. Lexi seemed to know exactly where to look, pulling county death records, property transfers, and newspaper clippings with practiced efficiency. A pattern emerged that made my skin crawl. Jake Franklin, Lexi said, pointing to a yellowed newspaper from 1923, found dead in what you now call the East Barn. The article says his body was discovered after neighbors noticed his livestock unattended for several days. Cause of death? I asked. Undetermined, she said. But the reporter noted unusual marks on the body and the fact that the barn door had been chained from the outside. I swallowed hard. Who owned it after Franklin? Several families over the next 40 years, Lexi said, flipping through property records. None stayed longer than 5 or 6 years until the Munoz family purchased it in 1961. She pulled out a small newspaper clipping from 1967. The Munoz family left suddenly that October. Their daughter vanished during harvest time, never found. They abandoned most of their belongings. And then my grandfather bought it, I said quietly. Yes. Caden lived there peacefully for nearly 50 years, Lexi confirmed, studying my face, until his passing last spring. He was the only one who stayed, I murmured, more to myself than to her. He was careful, Lexi said, her voice dropping to near a whisper. Very careful about certain things. I looked up sharply. What things? Lexi hesitated, then closed the folder in front of her. Your grandfather respected the land and its peculiarities. He never disturbed what shouldn't be disturbed. The East Barn, I said. The scarecrow. The woman in white. The singing at night. Her eyes widened slightly, but she gave a small nod. You've seen them then? All but what's in the barn, I admitted, and I've found my grandfather's rules. Follow them, she said, her hand gripping my wrist with surprising strength. Caden survived because he never broke those rules. I spent the next few days reinforcing the farmhouse. I installed motion-activated floodlights around the perimeter, replaced weak door hinges, and added new deadbolts to every exterior door. The hardware store clerk raised his eyebrows at my purchases but said nothing. Each morning and evening, I checked the scarecrow in the north field. Its position had become a weather vane for the farm's strangeness. Sometimes I'd find it turned toward the house, other times facing the east barn or the forest edge. Once I discovered it had moved 15 feet closer to the house overnight, though the ground showed no signs of disturbance. I developed a careful routine when approaching it. I would walk to within 20 feet, complete my observation, then back away slowly while maintaining visual contact until I reached a safe distance. The feeling of being watched intensified whenever I was near it, as if the burlap sackhead with its crude charcoal eyes could actually see. The singing continued most nights, sometimes distant, sometimes circling the house. I remained inside with doors locked as instructed, tracking the voice from window to window as it moved around the property. My grandfather had survived 5 decades here by following his 4 simple rules. Jake Franklin had died in the East Barn. The Munoz family had lost their daughter during harvest. The pattern was clear. This land demanded respect and caution from those who lived on it. As I backed away from the scarecrow during my evening check, keeping my eyes fixed on its misshapen form, I realized I was no longer just a man who had inherited a farm. I had inherited a responsibility to maintain whatever precarious balance existed between the natural and supernatural aspects of this property. The scarecrow's head seemed to tilt slightly as I retreated, though no breeze stirred the surrounding corn. I noticed the singing grew more frequent as Halloween approached. The pattern had become familiar, an eerie melody that always began near the woods at midnight, moved closer to the house, circled the entire property, then faded back toward the trees. It was like clockwork, this ritual, and I'd gotten into the habit of sitting by the kitchen window during these episodes, watching for any movement while I listened to that haunting voice. The voice itself was hard to describe. Sometimes it sounded like a woman, sometimes like a child. The melody never changed, though, a strange, undulating tune that didn't match any song I recognized. Not quite a lullaby, not quite a dirge, but something unsettling that fell between the two. Tonight was the third night in a row I'd heard it. I sat in the wooden chair I'd pulled up to the kitchen window, a mug of cold coffee forgotten on the windowsill. The calendar on the wall showed October 24th, just a week until Halloween, and the singing had increased from once every few nights to almost nightly. The voice drifted closer to the house, and I tracked its movement by sound alone. My eyes strained against the darkness outside, catching only vague shapes and shadows. The floodlights I'd installed illuminated the immediate area around the house, creating a harsh boundary between light and dark that somehow made the darkness beyond seem even deeper. I checked my watch, 1:15 in the morning. The singing had been going on for nearly an hour now, circling the property in a widening, then narrowing spiral. It would be another 20 minutes or so before it faded back toward the tree line. My routine had become almost mechanical. Sit by the window, track the voice, wait for it to leave, then try to get some sleep. But sleep had been harder to come by lately. Even when the singing stopped, I found myself lying awake listening for any sound that seemed out of place. The next night, I couldn't sleep at all, not because of the singing that hadn't started yet, but because of something new, a scratching sound coming from the direction of the east barn. At first, I thought it might be branches scraping against the walls, but there weren't any trees close enough to touch the structure. I lay in bed, covers pulled up to my chin despite the fact I wasn't cold, and listened. The scratching continued, steady and persistent. Scratch, scratch, pause. Scratch, scratch, pause. Like something trying to get out or get in. By 11:30, I couldn't take it anymore. I got out of bed, pulled on my jeans and a heavy flannel shirt, and grabbed the flashlight from my bedside table. The rational part of my brain told me it was probably just an animal. A raccoon maybe, or a possum trying to find shelter as the nights got colder. But the part of me that had seen the scarecrow move, that had watched the woman in white drift along the tree line, that had followed bare footprints around my house, that part knew better. I stepped onto the porch and immediately felt the chill of the October night air. My breath fogged in front of my face as I switched on the flashlight and swept its beam across the yard. Nothing moved in the pool of light. The scratching continued, more urgent now. I took a deep breath and stepped off the porch. The grass crunched under my boots, stiff with frost despite it being only October. Each step I took toward the east barn felt like a mistake, but I kept going. The scratching grew louder, and now I could hear something else too. Voices, muffled and indistinct, like several people whispering all at once. I stopped about 20 yards from the barn, suddenly remembering my grandfather's first rule: never enter the east barn after dark. I wasn't planning to enter it. I just wanted to see what was making that noise. That's what I told myself as I took another step forward, and another, until I stood right in front of the chain doors. The scratching was frantic now, coming from just inside. The whispers had grown louder too, though I still couldn't make out any words. It sounded like dozens of voices all talking over each other. I raised the flashlight, illuminating the heavy chains and padlocks that secured the doors. Without thinking, I reached out and touched one of the chains. It was ice cold, colder than it should have been, even on a frosty night. The metal felt wrong somehow, like it was pulling heat from my fingers rather than just being cold itself. The moment my skin made contact with the chain, everything stopped. The scratching, the whispers, all of it vanished in an instant, leaving behind a silence so complete it felt physical, like a pressure against my ears. I stood frozen, my hand still on the chain, afraid to move. The silence stretched on for what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds. Then I slowly withdrew my hand and took a step back. Nothing happened. No sound returned. The entire farm seemed to be holding its breath. I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes fixed on the barn doors. I remembered what Lexi had told me about my grandfather. that he had survived because he followed the rules. I had just broken one of those rules, and the sudden absolute silence felt like a warning. I continued backing up, one careful step at a time, never turning my back to the barn. The flashlight beam trembled slightly in my hand, casting jumping shadows across the weathered wood. I kept expecting the scratching to resume, or the doors to burst open, but nothing happened, just that unnatural silence. When I finally reached the house, I slipped inside and locked the door behind me. I checked every window and door twice, then sat in my grandfather's recliner until dawn, watching the east barn through the front window. Morning came with a pale, watery light that did little to dispel the uneasiness I felt. After making a pot of coffee I barely touched, I forced myself to go back out to the barn. In daylight, the east barn looked the same as always, weathered gray wood, boarded windows, chained doors. But as I got closer, I noticed something that hadn't been there before. Deep scratch marks ran along the exterior walls, starting near the ground and extending upward as high as I could reach. They looked like they'd been made by massive claws, gouging inches into the solid wood. I ran my fingers over one of the marks. The wood was splintered and raw, definitely fresh damage. Whatever had made these marks had been powerful. No raccoon or possum could have done this. I went back to the house and called the sheriff's office. Deputy Joshua Barnes arrived about an hour later in his patrol car, clipboard in hand as he got out. "Morning, Cody," he said, adjusting his hat. "Dispatch said you reported some vandalism." I led him to the east barn and showed him the scratch marks. He examined them closely, running his fingers along the gouges just as I had done. "These are pretty deep," he admitted, frowning. "But I don't see any footprints or tire tracks. No sign anyone's been here besides you." "What kind of animal could do this?" I asked. Joshua shook his head. "No animal around here makes marks like these. Bears might, but we haven't had bears in this county for decades." He stepped back, looking uncomfortable. "Could be weather damage. We had those strong winds last week. Might have blown something against the barn." It was such a ridiculous explanation that I almost laughed. No wind could carve foot-long claw marks into solid wood. But I could see in his eyes that he didn't believe his own explanation either. He just didn't have a better one, or didn't want to admit the one he might be thinking of. "I'll file a report," he said, already backing toward his car. "Maybe increase patrols in the area for a while. You should think about getting some security cameras out here." I thanked him, knowing the report would probably be filed away and forgotten. As his patrol car disappeared down the driveway, I turned back to look at the barn. The scratch marks seemed to mock me, physical proof of something that shouldn't exist. I faced all four phenomena in one night as November began. The crisp autumn air had given way to a bone-deep chill that seemed to settle over the farm like a shroud. I'd spent the day reinforcing windows and checking locks, a growing unease making my movements hurried and clumsy. When I looked out the front window that afternoon, my heart nearly stopped. The scarecrow from the north field had moved again, but this time it wasn't a subtle shift of position. It now stood at the very edge of my front yard, a mere 30 feet from the porch steps. Its burlap face sagged in a grotesque approximation of a smile, arms outstretched as if in welcome. I backed away from the window, my mouth dry. The scarecrow had never come this close before. In all my observations, it had remained within the confines of the cornfield, moving positions but never leaving its domain. This was different. This was an invasion. I kept my eyes fixed on it as I moved through the house, making sure I never fully turned my back on the thing. Rule number 2 had become second nature to me by now. Never turn your back on the scarecrow in the north field. Even though it was no longer in the north field, I wasn't taking any chances. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in streaks of orange and purple, I caught movement at the tree line. She was there, the woman in white. Her dress seemed to glow against the darkening forest, billowing around her even though the air was still. I watched from my kitchen window as she drifted along the boundary between my property and the woods, her movements fluid and unnatural. I kept my eyes down, focusing on the coffee mug in my hands instead of making eye contact with her. Rule number 3. If you see a woman in white near the tree line, don't acknowledge her presence. I'd followed this rule faithfully since the first time I'd seen her, and I wasn't about to break it now. The last rays of sunlight disappeared beyond the horizon, plunging the farm into darkness save for the security lights I'd installed around the perimeter. I moved through the house, checking locks and drawing curtains. The scarecrow remained visible through the front window, a dark silhouette against the floodlit yard. It was earlier than usual, not quite 10 o'clock, when I heard it, the singing. The high, clear voice drifted across the property, starting near the tree line where I'd last seen the woman in white. The melody was the same as always, haunting and wordless, neither lullaby nor dirge, but something unsettling in between. I settled into my grandfather's recliner, positioned to keep an eye on the front window and the scarecrow beyond. Rule number 4. If you hear singing at night, stay inside with doors locked. I'd already secured every entrance twice over. The singing grew louder as it approached the house, and then something new happened. From the direction of the east barn came a violent scratching sound, much more intense than what I'd heard before. This wasn't the steady scratch pause pattern I'd grown accustomed to. This was frantic, desperate, the sound of something trying to claw its way out. Then came the pounding, heavy thuds that I swore I could feel through the floorboards despite the distance between the house and barn. The chains must have been rattling against the wood, though I couldn't hear that specific sound over the scratching and pounding. I sat rigid in the chair, my knuckles white as I gripped the armrests. All 3 phenomena were active at once. The scarecrow, unnaturally close to the house, the woman in white, whose singing now circled the property, and whatever was in the east barn, more agitated than I'd ever heard it. The singing changed course, no longer circling the property, but coming straight toward the house. It grew so loud that it seemed to be coming from inside the walls themselves. I pressed my hands over my ears, but it did nothing to muffle the sound. The melody seemed to vibrate in my chest, as if bypassing my ears entirely. Through it all, I kept my eyes on the scarecrow. Even in the darkness, illuminated only by the security lights, I could see it hadn't moved from its spot at the edge of the yard. But somehow, that was more terrifying than if it had, as if it were content to simply watch what was about to unfold. The scratching from the barn reached a fever pitch, accompanied by the pounding that now sounded like something throwing its entire weight against the doors. I thought of the claw marks I'd found, imagining what kind of creature could gouge solid wood so deeply. Hours passed this way, with me trapped in a symphony of horror, the singing that seemed to come from everywhere at once, the violent assault on the east barn, and the silent, watchful presence of the scarecrow just outside my door. I must have dozed off despite the cacophony, because when I opened my eyes, weak morning light was filtering through the curtains. The singing had stopped. The scratching and pounding from the barn were silent. The only sound was the gentle chirping of birds welcoming the dawn. My body ached as I pulled myself from the chair. I'd spent the entire night there, afraid to move, afraid to break any of the rules that had kept me safe so far. I approached the front window cautiously and pulled back the curtain. The scarecrow was gone from the yard. I scanned the property until I spotted it back in the north field, standing exactly where it had been when I first arrived at the farm, facing east toward the sunrise, as if it had never moved at all. I unlocked the front door with trembling hands and stepped outside. The ground was soft from recent rainfall, but as I circled the house, I found no footprints, not the delicate bare feet of the singing woman, not my own from yesterday, nothing. The earth around my house was smooth and undisturbed. My gaze turned to the east barn. I approached it cautiously, half expecting to find the wooden walls shredded after the violent sounds of the night before. But when I reached it, I stopped in disbelief. The deep claw marks that had scored the exterior were completely gone. The weathered gray wood was intact, showing no signs of the damage I'd documented, no signs of the gouges Deputy Barnes had touched with his own hands. I stood there in the morning light, looking from the innocuous scarecrow to the unmarked barn to the smooth earth around my house. In that moment, I understood something fundamental about my grandfather's rules. They weren't just superstitious precautions or eccentric habits. They were a contract of sorts, an acknowledgement of an ancient balance that existed on this land long before any Lawrence ever set foot on it. By following the rules, my grandfather hadn't merely protected himself from harm. He had maintained an equilibrium, a delicate peace between whatever forces dwelled here and those who wished to live alongside them. I made a crucial decision to fully embrace my grandfather's legacy. After the strange events of early November, I couldn't continue pretending I was just a regular farmer who happened to have a few supernatural quirks on his property. This was Caden's life for decades, and now it was mine. The farmhouse attic had remained largely untouched since I moved in. I'd gone up there once to store some boxes, but hadn't explored the space properly. Now I climbed the narrow stairs with purpose, pulling the dangling cord to illuminate the single bulb that cast long shadows across the rafters. The attic was surprisingly organized. Cardboard boxes labeled in my grandfather's neat handwriting lined the walls. Family photos, Christmas decorations, old clothes, all categorized with care. What caught my attention was a wooden trunk tucked beneath the small round window. Unlike the other containers, this one had no label, just a simple brass latch. I dragged it to the center of the attic floor where the light was better. The trunk wasn't locked, just secured with the latch. Inside, I found stacks of leather-bound journals, at least 24 of them, each dated on the spine. They spanned from the early 70s, when Caden first bought the property, to just months before his death. I carried them down to the kitchen table in armfuls, arranging them chronologically. This would take time to process properly. I made a pot of coffee, pulled out a notebook to take my own notes, and began with the earliest journal from 1972. Over the next several days, I barely left the house except to check on the scarecrow and perform essential farm tasks. I read through meals late into the night and first thing each morning. The journals revealed a man I'd known but never fully understood. Caden had received the rules from the Munoz family, the previous owners who fled after their daughter vanished. Mr. Munoz had pressed a folded paper into my grandfather's hands during the property closing, insisting he read it only after the sale was complete. The rules weren't Caden's creation. They had been passed down, owner to owner, survivor to survivor. The early journals documented my grandfather's skepticism, much like my own when I first arrived. But that changed quickly. His third entry from 1972 described his first encounter with the singing, how he nearly walked outside to investigate before remembering the rule. The next morning, he found deep footprints in the soil that led from the tree line to each window of the house, then back to the forest. I read about the woman in white appearing during his first harvest season. Caden wrote that he accidentally made eye contact once early in his ownership. She smiled at him, not kindly, and began walking toward him with unnatural speed. He ran to the house and locked himself inside for 3 days while she paced the perimeter, sometimes pressing her pale face against the windows. The scarecrow entries were the most frequent. My grandfather tracked its movements meticulously, noting correlations with weather patterns, moon phases, and other farm events. He believed its position served as warnings. Facing the east barn meant something was trying to get out. Facing the house meant the woman in white would appear. Facing the road meant strangers might come who wouldn't understand the rules. But it was the east barn entries that made my skin crawl. Caden had inherited the barn already chained and locked, just as I had, but his curiosity had nearly gotten him killed. In 1975, he cut one of the chains. He didn't enter, just loosened one restraint. That night, the scratching became so violent it split the wooden walls. The singing circled for hours, and the scarecrow appeared at his bedroom window, peering in with its burlap face pressed against the glass. Caden wrote that whatever lived in the east barn was ancient, predating the farm, the town, perhaps even human settlement in the region. He believed it had been trapped there long ago by someone who understood its nature and created the first set of rules to keep it contained. The other phenomena, the scarecrow, the woman, the singing, were either manifestations of its power or separate entities drawn to its presence. Most valuable were the ritual descriptions. My grandfather hadn't just followed the rules. He had actively maintained the property's delicate balance through specific practices. During harvest, he placed 3 ears of fresh corn at the scarecrow's feet, an offering that kept it in the field for at least a month. On full moons, he kept a white candle burning in the north-facing window from sunset to sunrise. At each solstice, he walked the property boundaries at dawn, reciting words in a language he didn't understand but had phonetically transcribed from Mr. Munoz's instructions. I took careful notes, creating my own reference guide. The next full moon was just 2 days away. I would need white candles. The winter solstice would follow in December. I practiced the phonetic chant until I could recite it smoothly. The phenomena continued their regular appearances as I read through the journals. The scarecrow shifted position daily, though it remained in the north field. The woman in white appeared at dusk near the tree line. The singing came most nights. The east barn occasionally emanated scratching sounds. Yet something had changed. The manifestations seemed less threatening now, less aggressive. When the singing circled the house, it sounded almost like a lullaby rather than a menacing taunt. The scarecrow's movements seemed less erratic, more predictable. Even the scratching from the east barn grew quieter, less frantic. I felt the farm accepting me as its caretaker, not just the physical land, but whatever forces dwelled here. By learning the history, by committing to the rituals, I was taking my place in a lineage of guardians. This wasn't just property ownership, it was stewardship of something beyond ordinary understanding. On the night after I finished reading the final journal, I fell into an exhausted sleep. In my dreams, I stood at the edge of the cornfield under a harvest moon. The scarecrow was in its usual position, the east barn quiet in the distance. At the field's edge stood my grandfather, not as I had last seen him in the hospital, frail and diminished, but as I remembered him from childhood visits. Tall, strong, his face weathered but eyes bright. He didn't speak, just stood there looking over the land, then turned to me and nodded slowly, a gesture of approval and passing of responsibility. In the dream, I nodded back, accepting what he offered. When I woke the next morning, sunlight streaming through my bedroom window, something had settled inside me. The uncertainty and fear that had colored my first months here had transformed into something else, a deep connection to the land and to my family's history that I had never experienced before. This strange, demanding place was now truly mine, and I was truly its. I settled into a routine that would have seemed bizarre to me a year ago, but now felt like second nature. Every morning before breakfast, I checked the scarecrow's position in the north field, noting its orientation in my journal with the same methodical care my grandfather had shown for decades. Today it faced east toward the rising sun, a good sign according to Caden's notes. When it faced that direction, the farm typically remained calm. The kitchen table had become my command center, covered with my grandfather's leather journals, alongside my own growing collection of notebooks. I'd developed a system of colored tabs to mark correlations between lunar phases and supernatural activity. Red tabs for full moons when the singing grew loudest, blue for the quarter moons when the scarecrow moved most frequently, and yellow for the new moons when the east barn fell completely silent. I sipped coffee while reviewing yesterday's entry. The woman in white had appeared at the tree line just after sunset, lingering longer than usual, 13 minutes according to my stopwatch. I'd kept my eyes on my boots the entire time, remembering what happened to Caden that one time he'd made eye contact. The singing had started at exactly midnight, circling the house twice before fading back toward the trees. My phone buzzed with a text from Jackson Neal, asking if I needed help with the fence repair we'd discussed last week. Our relationship had evolved from cautious neighbor to something like friendship. He never directly acknowledged the farm's peculiarities, but he'd stopped questioning my habits, like why I refused to visit after dark or why I always kept my back to the north field when leaving. I texted back confirming our plans and headed outside to check on the chickens. The morning air carried the first hint of spring, though patches of frost still glittered on the ground. The chickens clucked contentedly as I scattered feed, seemingly unbothered by the farm's supernatural residents. Animals always sensed things before I did. When the hens grew quiet and huddled in the corner of their coop, I knew to be extra vigilant that night. Josephine from the feed store had started setting aside special items for me. White candles for the full moon ritual, specific herbs that Caden's journals mentioned as protective measures. She never explained how she knew what I needed, just smiled and said, "Your grandfather always bought these too." Last month, I'd overheard tourists at the general store talking about the haunted Thompson place just outside town. Lexi from the library had caught my eye across the aisle and given me a small, knowing nod. The locals had accepted me as the farm's caretaker, recognizing that I was maintaining the balance that Caden had preserved for so long. Deputy Barnes still drove by occasionally, slowing as he passed the east barn. He never mentioned the scratch marks that had disappeared, but sometimes he'd stop to chat about the weather or ask if I'd noticed anything unusual. I always said no, and he always looked relieved. The night of my 1-year anniversary on the property had been unlike any other. The scarecrow had shifted position every hour on the hour. I'd watched through binoculars from my bedroom window, tracking its slow rotation like the hand of some otherworldly clock. The woman in white had appeared at all 4 corners of the property simultaneously, her dress billowing in perfect synchronization despite standing in 4 separate locations. The singing had come from directly beneath the floorboards, so loud I could feel the vibrations through my feet. The east barn had remained eerily silent that night, more concerning than any amount of scratching or pounding. I'd followed the rules to the letter, staying inside with doors locked, keeping the white candle burning in the north window, and reciting the phonetic chant from Caden's journal every hour on the hour to match the scarecrow's movements. When morning finally came, I'd stepped onto the porch expecting, what? Destruction? Some sign of the night's intensity? Instead, I found a perfect circle of wildflowers surrounding the entire house, their blooms vibrant despite the February frost that coated everything else. Purple coneflowers, black-eyed Susans, and wild daisies, flowers that shouldn't bloom for months, formed an unbroken ring exactly 10 feet from the foundation. Jackson had driven up later that morning, stopping his truck abruptly at the site. He'd stepped out slowly, looking from the flowers to me. "Been here a year now, haven't you?" he'd asked. I nodded. "Your grandfather got those too. Said it meant the farm accepted him." He hadn't elaborated further, just nodded as if confirming something to himself. I understood then what Caden's journals had been trying to tell me. This wasn't just land passed down through generations. It was a responsibility, a covenant between my family and whatever ancient forces resided here. The rules weren't restrictions but a language, a way of communicating respect and boundaries that maintained a delicate peace. The flowers had faded after 3 days, but their message remained. I was the caretaker now, not just of acres and buildings, but of a balance that required constant vigilance and respect for traditions I still didn't fully understand. I finished my morning rounds and returned to the kitchen to add today's observations to my journal. The scarecrow still faced east. The east barn remained quiet. The ring where the flowers had bloomed was now just ordinary grass, but I could still trace its perfect circle in my mind. I knew that someday, hopefully many years from now, I would need to pass these rules to someone else, the next Lawrence to watch over this strange, demanding place. I would hand them the yellowed paper with the 4 rules, just as the Munoz family had done for Caden, and Caden had done for me. I would tell them to read it only after the property was legally theirs, and I would hope they would take their responsibility as seriously as I had learned to do. For now, though, I had found an unexpected peace in this unusual equilibrium. The farm's rhythms had become my own, and I no longer feared the singing or the woman in white or even the mysterious contents of the east barn. We had reached an understanding, this land and I, built on respect, watchfulness, and the wisdom of those who had come before.